What is an antagonist, and how do you make one that is compelling? So firstly, what is an antagonist? The hero of your story, or the main character, is often known as the protagonist of your story. And so the villain, or the antagonist, is any character and or force that acts against your hero as they try to accomplish the goal that they set out to accomplish in your story. Some examples of antagonists would be Scar from The Lion King, Darth Vader in Star Wars, Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, President Snow in the Hunger Games. Every story needs an antagonist, because without an antagonist, there would be no stories. If the Disney movie Moana did not have an antagonist, it would follow Moana, as she sets out to go restore the heart of Te Fiti. She gets into a boat, she sails across the ocean, she marches up to Te Fiti, she puts the heart back in, everything is fine, the movie's 10 minutes long, happy, happy, celebrate, the movie is over. This would be a very boring movie. The reason the movie is exciting is because there are obstacles and challenges standing in her way that she has to overcome in order to restore the heart of Te Fiti. All stories need antagonists because antagonists add tension to stories, they enhance the conflict, they enrich the plot. Every story that lacks an antagonist or antagonistic force is, simply put, a nothing burger. But that is not to say that every single antagonist has to be the Disney villain cloaked with green, cackling maniacally as the hero goes to eat the poison apple. There is a strong misconception that every antagonist has to be an evil villain who is evil for the sake of being evil. That is not the case, and you don't want your antagonist to be evil for the sake of being evil because that's just not that interesting. Your antagonist has to believe that they are the main character of their story and what they are doing is right. In most cases, your antagonist should not be aware that they are the antagonist. They should be the hero in their own view, acting to enact a plan or a set of values and morals that they truly believe is right, or they believe they're entitled to or justified to do. The heroes in your story should be the antagonists of your antagonist's story, which means that your antagonist has to have a story. There are 3 key characteristics to an effective antagonist. The first is that they should have depth. Evil is not a personality. Your antagonists should have deep and layered personalities, not just black and white characteristics. The more real you can make them, the better. Because the more real they seem and the more like real people they are, and the more of themselves the readers can see in the antagonist, they will be more intimidating and creepier. Like your evil dictator in your teen dystopian novel might be an evil dictator, but they also really might like corgis. Just because they are one thing doesn't mean they can't be a fully fleshed out character. And the more fleshed out you make them and the more human and relatable you make them, the scarier and eerier they're gonna be to the readers. Your dictator doesn't have to be a gruff old guy who is very hardened and is always angry about something. Your dictator can have a more complex personality. They could be younger. They could be really friendly until all of a sudden they're not. The second key characteristic of an effective antagonist is that they have to have relatable motivations. Your reader should understand why the character does what they do. Their motivations for doing what they're doing should be absolutely rock solid, very clear, and the reader should be able to understand exactly why that person wants what they want and why they're trying to do it. Not just, oh, the dictator is making all the kids fight to the death because he hates children and he's just evil. That is not as interesting as having a built-up psychological profile for how somebody could justify in their mind why a game like this is necessary in order to control a population over a long period of time. Bad people do horrible things in real life, but they're still people, so you have to make sure that you give them that element of humanity in order to be an effective villain. Evil for the sake of evil just doesn't cut it. It's not interesting. And the third characteristic is that their goals have to clash with your protagonists. They have to be in direct conflict with your protagonist over the course of the story in order to be an effective antagonist. What they want has to be mutually exclusive with what the hero wants. So if the antagonist wins, the hero does not win, and if the hero wins, the antagonist does not win. This raises the stakes for the story, and this makes it a lot more interesting and will make both parties really, really fight each other to try to get their side to be the one that comes out on top. So like with every character that you build for your story, your antagonist has to have a backstory. You have to understand how they came to be, why they believe the things that they do, and how their childhoods and past experiences have shaped them into the antagonist that they are. Your antagonist is arguably the most important character in your story, and so in a lot of cases, it would make sense to start with them and build this character first, because if you don't have a strong antagonist, you don't have a strong story. When I created my antagonist for my series, I started with the antagonist that I needed him to be in order to tell the story that I wanted to tell, and I worked backwards and tried to figure out how I could justify his worldview and what sort of backstory and psychological profile I could give him in order for him to justify what he does over the course of the series. But it's important to not fall into the trap of creating a very horrible backstory for your character and just using that to justify why they are just plain evil. Like, oh, my character loves to inflict pain on others and is just evil for the sake of being evil because he had a rough childhood. This is the easy thing to do, but it's not enough to create a really compelling antagonist. And having a rough childhood is fine, but a lot of people have rough childhoods and don't end up being completely insane, crazy, evil villains, and so there has to be an added layer or some more detailed events in there or a more detailed psychological profile to explain why they ultimately become super mega evil villain. There's a nature and nurture side to both of it. You want to have the physical events in the past coupled with the type of person that this person is and how they think about things and like how their framework on the world, and those two things together can create an antagonist history. So let's go over some examples of antagonists and break down exactly what makes them effective as antagonists. The first antagonist I will use as an example is Severus Snape from the Harry Potter books. I feel like I can make an entire video on this one all by itself. Part of what makes Snape a very compelling antagonist is that he's a very complicated character. At the beginning of the series, it just seems like he's a professor at Hogwarts who seems to have it out for Harry, and who does a lot of messed up stuff to Harry and his friends. No adult should be treating children that way, or speaking to children that way. And as the books progress, it is revealed that he had a complicated history with Harry's mother, and he had kind of a rough time of things, and he had his heart broken, and he was devastated over Lily's death. And so he had an empathetic, soft side, but he also chose to take that out on Lily's son when he was a student of his, which is still not a good thing to do. Snape saved Harry on some occasions, but also does treat Harry like garbage at the beginning, but does have some character growth. But Harry spends most of the series not trusting Snape because Snape has also been involved in some pretty shady things. For a lot of the books, it's really unclear where Snape stands, and at the end of the books, there is also some ambiguity about him. There's ambiguity surrounding him as a character, and because he's so complex, he's also unpredictable, and he's not easy to put into one box. He does a lot of things over the course of the series that puts him square in the antagonist box, but he also helps Harry on some occasions too. Snape is a very compelling antagonist because he's deep, he's complex, readers can't put him into any sort of box. Even though there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding where he stands and his motivations over many of the books, by the end of the series there has been some more light shed on that, and looking back you can understand how he was motivated and why he did the things he did, even if they weren't always right. And in a lot of cases, he is in direct conflict with the protagonist. And what Snape wants is the opposite of what Harry wants in a lot of cases. Not all of them, but some of them. And his backstory makes sense, and it explains why he ended up the way that he ended up, and why, he was bullied as a kid, and his childhood bully was Harry's father, and so it makes sense from that standpoint. Not that it's okay, but you're able to understand why he acted the way he did towards Harry. So this makes him a very interesting and compelling antagonist. Another memorable antagonist is President Snow from the Hunger Games. In the original trilogy, President Snow comes across as that sort of evil dictator old guy who is a little evil for the sake of being evil and just likes kids fighting to the death and likes watching that on TV and is totally fine with that. But in the prequel novel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, there's a lot of light shed on why and how Snow ended up becoming the way that he ultimately was. not only revealing his backstory and the difficult things that he had to go through as a child, but also his psychology and the way that he thought about the world. He did have a rough childhood and there were hard things that happened to him, but those hard things also happened to his cousin Tigress, and she didn't end up the way that he ended up. It's because of his psychology and his arrogance and the professors and teachers and guides that he had in his life that he developed his sort of Hobbesian view of the world, where in order to hold on to power, he had to keep everyone else squashed all the time. And it was really interesting in that novel reading about how his professors and his teachers justified the Hunger Games and what role that played in their society. While his motivations may not be relatable, because of his complex system of morality, they are understandable. His backstory is layered and multidimensional, and he's also always in conflict with the protagonists because he likes it when kids fight to the death, and Katniss doesn't want to have to fight to the death. So now, while that's all good in theory, what are some tips for writing engaging, compelling antagonists? The first one, avoid cliches. Please, oh pretty please, avoid evil for the sake of being evil. There are just so many more interesting options, and it will make your story so much better in every case when you put a little bit more thought into your antagonist. 2, you want them to be morally complex. Sure, your antagonist can be evil, but don't only make them evil. In the case of an antagonist like Snape, there was a lot of ambiguity around his morals, and you didn't always know how he was going to react to the protagonists. He did work against them for a large portion of the series, but he didn't do so just because he was trying to be evil. He had really nuanced reasons for behaving the way that he did. And 3, give them some kind of connection to the protagonist. Your protagonist and antagonists are two sides of the same coin in your story. These are two forces that are working against each other, and so it's really interesting when they have some sort of common ground between them. They both come from a similar background, they both share a similar characteristic or history. They share some personal connection, like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. They represent what the hero could have become if the hero made different choices. This will give them a reason to work off of each other and give the antagonist a reason for having a fixation on the hero and wanting to stop them. It makes the conflict almost more personal for the antagonist if the antagonist can see some of themselves in the protagonist, and the protagonist can see some of themselves in the antagonist. That can be very scary for the protagonist. You also don't have to be afraid of having multiple antagonists in one story. Your story can have multiple antagonists. Like in Harry Potter, Snape is not the primary antagonist of the Harry Potter series, yet he's still an antagonist. And Umbridge is an antagonist, and Barty Crouch Jr. is an antagonist, Bellatrix Lestrange is an antagonist. All of these antagonists are different and bring something different to the table and oppose the heroes in a different way. Now, you don't need this big of a cast in every single book and series, but it is a good thing to have multiple antagonists if you do have a story of this scale. In order to create an engaging story, you want your antagonist to be the right antagonist for your protagonist. You want this antagonist to be the force that balances your protagonist and is an even match for them, so it's unclear which one is going to come out on top. You want your antagonist to be perfectly designed to push your hero really far, emotionally, physically, and in the scheme of the plot. Oftentimes this comes with them having a lot of common ground. And so that's why it's really important and interesting to try and build your protagonist and antagonist together as you figure out how they play off of each other, because that relationship and that dynamic is going to be the driving conflict of your story. So that's it for this video on creating engaging, believable, and interesting antagonists. I hope you find it helpful. If you did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, my name is Claire Fraze, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. Do you have a favorite antagonist in a book, TV show, or movie? Drop it in the comments below and tell me why you love that antagonist so much. Analyzing why we gravitate towards characters in the media that we consume can really help us figure out what we personally like in stories, and that can greatly inform our own writing. I hope you have a fantastic week, everybody, and as always, Happy writing.